they're not talked about and labeled of like, hey, we need to cultivate a skill of empathy and active listening, or we need to cultivate a skill of social influence. How can you cultivate a skill if you haven't heard of it, or you don't know what it is, and then you don't know how to build a pathway of it?
Hi, friends, and welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of the Heartful Parent Podcast. I have a treat in store for you today, whenever it is that you are listening. And this one is geared towards, for all of you parents out there who are parenting tweens and teens. And you'll hear me say this in the episode, if you are parenting a younger child, don't walk away. Don't turn this off, because I think the information that today's guest is about to share with you is relevant and helpful and actionable, regardless of the age of your child. You know, especially at the end, we get into some questions and some information that I think can, for those parents who are parenting younger kiddos right now, knowing this information earlier will only serve you well. So hang in there. If you don't have a teenager, this is still for you. That being said, today's guest is a coach who works with teens. And you've heard me on the podcast interview, other coaches who work with teenagers, but this is a kind of a unique or different approach to that. So I'm about to introduce you to Will Kirsop. Will is an education leader and the founder and coach at Many Roads, which is a coaching business dedicated, as I said, to helping teenagers, but not just to helping teenagers like manage their day-to-day crap, but really to help them discover their purpose and to thrive in the world. Which is something we all want for our kids, right? We all want them to feel like they have a sense of purpose. We all want them to thrive. And Will's coach, really like the work I do with parents, is very forward thinking, very forward looking, right? Of where we're trying to get to down the road, not just how we're getting through today. Will has a background spanning business, education, and psychology, but he saw a gap in how young people are supported in discovering their unique path. He started Many Roads for that purpose, and his coaching blends evidence-based methodologies, behavioral and cognitive psychology, appreciative inquiry, which is the process that I use, and real-world strategy to help teens build confidence and direction for their future. Will has worked with teens from a dozen countries across a broad spectrum, from neurodiverse students to top performers competing on the world stage. Will has held general manager and chief commercial officer roles in startups. He holds a commerce degree from the University of Sydney and a psychology degree from Swinburne University, where he graduated with a 4.0 GPA and came first place in half his subjects. He has also completed executive education at UC Berkeley. He is an avid surfer, as you will hear. He travels around the world surfing. He's also a mediator, a lifelong learner, and he is passionate about leveraging his professional and life experiences to help students navigate purpose, career planning, and well-being. Will is, spoiler alert, younger than I am. He walks the talk. He's connecting with teens, and he's got a pretty cool life story to boot. So I hope you will join me and in hearing from Will and how he works with teens, but also, and most importantly, how each of you can best support your own kiddos as they look forward to a future that is one in which they feel passionate and in which they thrive. Without further ado, Will Kirsop. All right, Will, welcome to the podcast. It's so great to have you here.
Hey, Christy, I'm delighted. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we've tried a few times to get this on the calendar and we've had to reschedule it. So I'm really grateful to finally be here and diving into really a lot of teenagery stuff today. So I'll just throw out for those parents who don't have teens yet, hang in there, listen, because this will still be relevant to you. But Will, I want to start with finding out, I read your bio, heard the formal thing, where you went to school, what your qualifications are, et cetera, et cetera. But you also live a pretty crazy, and by crazy, I mean fun life and have an interesting work-life balance. So let's start there. Talk about where you're from and kind of how you move through the world doing the work that you do.
Yeah, sure. So for those on here, I always just can jump in and start by saying to all the parents and educators and everyone tuning in, just I'm always just like really mind blown by the dedication and commitment and what goes into supporting teens and just families in general. So you guys are really awesome, and it's such a privilege to collaborate in these spaces. From my own kind of standpoint, I was born and raised in Sydney, Australia. And I guess since, graduating from high school and doing all those things, I always just loved traveling. So when I actually finished high school with my closest friend, I was 17 and we traveled around Europe and the US together for a couple of months before starting college. So I'd always worked in high school, and that was a big motivator for me. And I just always remember thinking, whoa, I just want to be able to travel and do all of those things. So I had the opportunity to live in the US in my early 20s, which was a lot of fun, living in California. I think also ended up studying at UC Berkeley later on. And yeah, I've lived in France as well. And today I'm actually based out of Bali, so Bali, Indonesia. So the way I kind of conduct my life a little bit is I almost share my time between Australia, Indonesia, and then I try to get to Hawaii for the winter surf season. So surfing's been a big calling for me. And I guess I've always thought, how can I integrate the things that I love doing and have a really high quality day-to-day life, but also giving back and making sure that I'm, contributing in the ways that I can use, skills and the talents and those different things that I might have, my abilities in a meaningful way. And that's taken me on a journey with a number of different things. I've worked in nonprofit. I've built a social enterprise before. I've worked kind of in education for the last 7 or 8 years, and obviously with Many Roads at the moment. So yeah, it's such a pleasure to be able to do this work. I feel really grateful for it. And I guess just, sometimes means some really early mornings here in Indonesia when I'm connecting with you guys in the States, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
I mean, I have to admit, I'm not a surfer, but I find myself a little envious of being able to go from Hawaii to Bali to Australia and back again on a regular basis. I love where I live. Seattle, don't be offended, but those sound like pretty heavenly places to be.
I definitely feel very, very fortunate. And, it's taken some time, cultivating this life and getting to this point. So it's something that I'm very grateful for. And honestly, I was just thinking about it yesterday. I was I just pinch myself every day. I had a surf yesterday and it was 11:30 in the morning and it's a beautiful day. It's just I feel just so lucky, and getting to do meaningful work at the same time. It's very,
Love
very
it.
nice.
So let's talk about that meaningful work a little bit. As you said, you've done some different things in your background. What made you wake up one day? I mean, it may not have been one day, but what made you kind of say, "Hey, I have something to offer teens
Yeah.
and I want to work with teens. I'm going to start this Many Roads business."
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, pathways are never linear. I guess that's how I always think about it. It's not just A to B to C. Sometimes we take this big leap forward, or maybe we take a little detour to the left and then one to the right and end up in a space. So I think at its core, Christy, is that I've always been really interested in that project of having a good life, on a very personal level, and always been interested in how do people live these really rich lives of meaning and fulfillment. And then some other people maybe are a little bit more stuck and don't maybe get to that point. So I think that was something I just always internalized. And so for me, it was, how do you kind of live this project of having a good life, and what that means different things to different people. And then I had a really cool opportunity to start working in education. I've done a few things in that space, and on a very macro level, helped build a really large career and life advice platform as part of a team that reached over 1 million people, teenagers, young adults each year. And then after doing that work, I actually decided to go back to school and study psychology because I was really interested in and understanding it probably at a bit of a deeper space. So I continued my work in education on a more micro level, then in one-to-one coaching, doing some college admissions counseling and things like that. So between those two roles, I guess I saw some of these real challenges that a lot of families are facing, things like executive function, uncertainties around career planning, life after school. and device dependence, and then just like how tough it is for a teenager to go through like what I might refer to as the trials and tribulations of adolescence. So that's what motivated me, instead of actually continuing the psychology down to maybe like a clinical route, was seeing that there's this whole band or layer of teenagers who just need some support, can need help, and then really merging and bringing those two things together, the psychology and the education that is, and birthing many roads, I guess. So that's kind of what led me to being here. And yeah.
I love it. I mean, I think you're right. As the parent of a teenager myself, they do need a lot of support. But I'm curious because I think a lot of adults, like, look, I was a teenager. It sucks. I get it. Unless you're in that small little subset of people that like live your best life in high school, most of us realize that those were not the best years. We're not eager to go back to the teenage years. But I often hear adults say, I lived through it, you'll live through it too.
Yeah.
Right? You'll be fine. Without a lot of appreciation for the ways in which being a teenager in the year 2025 might be different than it was. I'm dating myself a little bit, but when I was a teenager back in the 80s. So, talk with us a little bit about what is different. What are the challenges that our teenagers are dealing with right now that is unlike what any of us who are parenting dealt with when we were teens?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I always do say, of course, these teenage years were, marked by complexity for everyone. It's never been easy. And we know all the things that are going on from like neural development, hormones, socially, emotionally, like they're always, quite fraught even for a lot of us. But it is different in today's day and age. And I think I like to think about it in the sense of there's like four kind of different factors. So one, and I maybe just alluded to earlier, but like AI and the future of work, I mean, that's just so much more different and opaque than ever before. So you're a teenager, you're hearing things, British Council, for instance, 65% of jobs in work like that you're going to work in the future don't currently exist. Well, that makes it probably pretty hard to be engaged at school and thinking about a future pathway and getting excited about things when that's what you're hearing. Secondly, we've got, social media and this kind of, cultivation or like of the self, right? And this, teens are looking up to all these people who are maybe like entrepreneurs of the self. And there's all this pressure to start thinking about yourself in that way and creating content and different things. And that can be great. And that can provide a lot of opportunities, but maybe for, certainly a subset, it leads to comparison. And there are a number of different challenges, and disproportionately, they tend to impact teenage girls, particularly. The third one, we look at, I guess, like the culture of instant gratification. It's just so different, right? We've got DoorDash and Uber Eats delivering things super quick. We've got same day Amazon delivery. So we're just expecting things really quickly. And that's all of us. It's not just teenagers, but that's at the same time that then, we've got all this uncertainty, which is quite strange. And then the fourth and final one, COVID obviously had a huge impact. And with my work and what I see with a lot of teenagers, I think that maybe we haven't really touched even the tip of the iceberg really with some of the impacts we're going to see with some of the teenagers, because they went through like pivotal years with this flip-flop of like online and in-person learning and all these different modalities, and trying to like almost having to like be at home and flip up the laptop at like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old and like have the motivation to do school. And there's all this other peripheral stuff going on in the world of COVID at the time. So those are some of the core factors that I think mark it, quite different from I guess what we, traditionally went through in previous generations, we will say.
Yeah. I mean, I listened to you list those off. And first of all, did I hear you correctly that it's like 65% of the jobs that our teens will have don't exist yet?
Yeah, that's
65.
65%, so two-thirds. Yeah. So
Wow.
that's the British Council in 2021. So I mean, where they, necessarily get all these numbers from, but I think it's illustrative more of just the discourse, right? That's, I think, what, is particularly interesting, I guess, about the way they're talking about it, and to teens and families and everyone.
Well, I mean, for sure. Because as you say that, I'm like, there's sort of two major things that come out of that. Like, we as the adults are often saying, pick a career, like decide what you want to do.
Yeah.
And that may be difficult to do if the job doesn't even exist yet,
Yeah.
right? Like, there's all these opportunities that will reveal themselves, I guess. But then too, I like the impact of that on a teen who's like, I don't even know what I'm gonna need to know.
Yeah.
So what is any of this, right? The school stuff, algebra or chemistry, or I'm going through my child's own schedule, but
Yeah.
humanities or whatever, what does that have to do with
Yeah.
this? You can't even tell me, mom,
Yeah.
dad, you don't even know.
Yeah, it's definitely hard. And I think you touched on a great point there, Christy. It's almost like it was a known unknown, right? Of like, oh, I know that I need to do chemistry, but I don't know chemistry yet. I need to learn the periodic table. But now it's almost this like unknown unknown of like, we don't know what I need to do and why. And those are questions I actually hear a lot from teens of like, oh, why do I have to do Algebra 2 trig in grade 9, right? Or how come, we have to learn Shakespeare or the classics, or like I need to learn Catcher in the Rye and things of those nature. And interestingly, in my work, like that's where I can actually try and like drive a little bit of a wedge and have those conversations. So a lot of the work that I tend to do, and I would say the nexus and the core and the thesis of my work is that actually finding fulfilling, meaningful work. And, I talk about the word purpose a little bit as well. And there's like a literature definition we might get into, but the core of it is if you can maybe find what that is for you. And of course, it's maybe a little bit more opaque than it used to be, but understanding from a teen standpoint, what are my spikes? Like, what are those skills? What are those strengths? What are those interests that I want to cultivate? Then we can start thinking about like a bit more of a personalized pathway that's going to help them get to the where they want to get to. So we have, discussions around like what are the skills that they might like to learn and how do we cultivate those? And then from back to like contextualizing math or English, let's say that they align to like they're quite interested in whether it's trains or bridges or like an engineering standpoint. Well, that's how we can like contextualize math and start talking about it ladders up into future years where you might have to do stat if you end up going to college and pursuing an engineering pathway. Or we might talk on like the other side of things with English, and there's a whole lot of different roles that might need to be persuasive, whether it's sales or law. And how do you write, an argumentative, persuasive essay that might include quotes from like a different text that you're doing to illustrate a point and to convince the reader of something? Or maybe how do you do that verbally in, say, a context of a presentation at school or a debate? So those are some of the different ways I can help contextualize
Yeah.
the work that we're doing.
I love that. And I have to also imagine, to sort of go to one of your other points, that it's a little bit of a challenge, because one of the things that I hear from a lot of young people is, and that freaks parents out without fail,
Mhm.
right? Is, I want to be a professional video game player,
Yeah, yeah,
right? Or I want to be an influencer, right? Because they
yeah,
see, and I love this phrase that you used, which is not one that I have heard before, but the entrepreneurship of the self,
yeah.
right? This self-promotion kind of culture that we have found ourselves in, that we are in, have created, I guess. There's, and that freaks parents out. And so then you've got kids going, I don't even know what jobs I'm going to need to do. And you've got a method for approaching that. And they're like, but I could just go over and do this. Do you see that a lot with teens that have gotten maybe hooked onto that idea of the promotion of self in a way that's really not serving them?
Yeah, I definitely do see it. And I would say I probably see it more with like the gaming maybe than the influencer type path. I think that the positive thing I do think is intuitively, it's almost like wanting to be a musician or an artist or a sports star, and back in maybe our generations, right? Like
Yeah.
we know that, there's only one Picasso or, whatever that may be for Michael Jordan for a sports star, whatever it is. And that it's not necessarily like something that, we're going to end up doing, but we might have like a deep interest in wanting to put time and effort and energy in, but realizing that not everyone ends up being actually able to do that from like a career and a monetization standpoint. And I think that often I'll just take when those things surface, I'll actually take them on like, well, how do you think that person makes money? And we'll actually talk about, the economic model or the commercial model of those people's lives and what it actually involves. And sometimes it's maybe not actually as appealing for them as they might think when you actually look at the nuts and bolts of it. And for some, it may be in great. And obviously a lot of people are making really good careers out of doing those things. And that's not to take anything away from those people. But yeah, it
Yeah.
sometimes shifts the perspective a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and as you said, there's only one Michael Jordan. Like, we're not all going to be the next big social media influencer,
Yeah.
right?
And I think
Yeah.
that to run off that a little bit is they may be more interested in being like the video game creator or the designer, I tend to find, than being the actual like gamer that uploads their things on YouTube or plays competitively. So, and I think that's really encouraging because it's, again, to just use the sports example of, and even this is like me as a teen, I used to really like the NBA and Kobe Bryant, right? But I had at the time was quite analytical and was thinking about doing accounting. And then I was thinking, well, the Los Angeles Lakers need an accountant, right? So they're maybe applying this in like different ways and understand that they have this interest, but how do we have a conversation if like that's the domain you want to go in? How do you find yourself in that arena? That might be something that they're interested in.
Layered over all of this, and you mentioned this one, is the reality of the COVID years. But what you said is that you don't think we've even touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of the actual impact
Yeah.
that had on our teens. And my daughter started middle school online the year that COVID hit back in 2020, and it's really challenging. But I think
Yeah.
a lot of us as adults are like, okay, that we've been there, done that, like it's over, it's in the past. We've kind of moved on.
Yeah.
But what I hear you saying is that maybe teens have not.
Yeah. And this isn't to be all fatalistic. I'm just probably taking the data and how I'm, interpreting it. And so when I tend to talk and work with teens, I do a lot of like guided exercises. So it might be like short reflective writing, or, it can be dialogue based as well. And like, what's one of the biggest challenges you faced? And what's one of the, worst things that's happened to you? Nearly you see 2020, 2021, just like down the bottom right. And that's really what I'm hearing from them at like face value, I guess, firstly. And then secondly, what we're seeing on like college campuses is that like kiddos are like they're adults at that time generally, but they're not actually wanting what I would refer to as like the best part of college is like going and having the socialization and things like that. Like there is this, I guess, like anxiety around having those interactions, and we're seeing higher rates than ever before of school refusal and things of that nature. And those are some of the challenges that, I'm getting briefed on by parents and things like that. So that's why I think we haven't maybe seen the effects of it. And then you just probably thinking about it more broadly is that the vehicle that, they're having for communication is just very, very screen based. And that, I guess, accelerated that in a very different way. So when I've worked with teens, and sometimes I do like in-person sessions, depending on where I am in the world, it can actually, some of these cues can be a lot harder for them to have like an in-person conversation, right? And that they're actually a lot more comfortable on that. So those are some of the ripple effects that I think we're seeing, and, we will continue to see
Yeah.
in the time to come.
Yeah. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking back to my college experience, which again, I'm dating myself, but I'm having my 30-year college reunion this year. And it was all, I mean, yes, there were the academics, right? Those mattered, of course, but it was really about the socialization, the meeting other students, building friendships, building lifelong friendships,
Yeah.
going to parties, and and the building independence.
Yeah.
And I think we're not seeing that in the same way, that independence piece in particular.
Yeah, it's such a big point. And so there's a cohort and interestingly, actually wasn't where I was like intending to take my work, focusing on teens, but a huge part of the work that I'm getting, or like the families that I'm supporting, are people who are like, we might say like failing to launch. And I'd probably soften it by just saying struggling with that transition to independence. And it typically seems to be, at least the cases that I'm talking to, young men, maybe they're starting college, maybe they've completed college, and they generally like don't have strong social relationships. They may be gaming a lot. Maybe there's like marijuana use, things of that nature. They're maybe not like dating at all, and the parents are having questions around those things. So there seems to be this like elongation of adolescence into this amorphous like young adulthood, but it's not really adulthood. And obviously there are different factors as well. We're seeing the like cost of living crisis and things of that nature. So those are definitely the things that I'm hearing, but there is this elongation, I guess it seems. And what that's enabled me to do in my teenage practice is actually bring it back and have conversations of like, hey, what does like adulthood look like for you? And like, you might go to college, but like, when's the time you want to really step out and launch into like being completely independent? And what age is that for you? And I think starting those conversations early can actually be quite important, because Otherwise, you might wake up and the teenagers, or like not a teen anymore, and still maybe not on that pathway to independence. And that looks, different for every family, but I think it is something it's certainly being elongated.
Yeah. I'm curious. I have my own thoughts about this, but what are things that you are seeing parents do
Yeah.
or fail to do that is contributing to that elongation, right? That isn't actually supportive towards independence. Because it's not just right, these kids don't live in a vacuum. They're
Yeah.
not doing this to themselves. Like we as parents are contributing to the entire dynamic
Absolutely.
here, right? So what are you seeing either with the parents that you talk to or that is reported to you by the kids or just,
Yeah.
things that you've noticed is or isn't happening that a parent listening to this could say, oh,
Yeah.
maybe I need to shift X, Y, or Z.
Yeah. Do you know one of the best things? I used to work with someone, and he was on my team, and he was maybe 22 or 23 at the time, and his parents had this policy of 24 out the door. And like he was working and he was saving his money, and but like he knew that like that 24th birthday, that was when he had to shift up and out. And I always just thought like it was almost, 24 out the door. It was hilarious to even hear, but I actually think that structure was really good. So we think about it from like a parenting standpoint. Obviously, we want two things, right? Like high standards and high structure on one side, and then like high warmth, high empathy, high support on the other. Sometimes I think parents can possibly tend to being like a little bit too permissive. And that's probably the challenge a little bit, where there's that warmth and structure, and obviously it's amazing support, but where's the other side? Where's, I guess, that structure and those expectations around shifting up and out? So for parents, I think that, who are listening, and obviously everything's really well intentioned. I never think it's poorly intentioned, but
Right.
it's obviously hard, right? Because there's, maybe there's, the cost of living crisis, the job market, all of things of that nature. But how do you gradually start by having those conversations initially, and then maybe putting things in place of, if the kiddo is at home, how do you maybe start charging the board and things of that nature, so they can start, having more responsibility and more ownership and more accountability. And then, then hopefully that ladders up to the point where they can step up and out onto their own 2 feet. So I think that when those cases, and not in all times is the parenting too permissive, but I think that sometimes, it just does, the behavior sort of gets enabled and there isn't any pathway, because like there's no incentive, right, for this, young adult to really, why would you want to go and, pay all this money each month when it's really like, you've got maybe your own space. And sometimes those spaces, I think, that are accommodated by parents are still quite private, and maybe they're like in a detached part of, a house or in a separate room, so that the young adult in this case feels quite comfortable is what I've observed. So, and it's not about making them uncomfortable, but just taking them on that journey to that transition and having the dialogue around that.
It might be making them a little uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
I have to say, like, as somebody who promotes positive discipline, I'm a positive discipline educator, and I really value, what you were just talking about, which is that really that balance between the kindness and the empathy and also the firmness and the structure. But I do see that in, many arenas, this move towards less authoritarian parenting has confounded a lot of parents, and they have slipped, again, all well-intentioned, but slipped too far into that permissive piece that you're describing. And then suddenly we're not setting up that structure to help kids figure out, how do I get out the door at 24?
And yeah, structure is just such a big thing. And one thing that's I always think this is quite funny in my practice, Christy. I'll join a session, I'll be like, hey, kiddo, like, is there anything you want to focus on today? Is there anything you want to get out of today? And so I give them this freedom, right? And I still always do it, because sometimes things might come up and I think it's important to be intentional about that. But they're like, no, I'm just happy for what you've got planned. And I always obviously have exercises planned and things. And like, so they're actually looking to us for this structure. Like they actually want that from us. And this isn't only parents, this is teachers, educators, coaches, whoever that may be in these teens' lives. So they're actually expecting this from us. And it's almost this curveball when they like don't have it and they don't really know how to deal with it. So they're actually craving that, I think. And they, boundaries need to be in place, because they're probably going to push them a little bit and they're going to try and push against them. But so it's about thinking about what is that right boundary for, your family, and enacting that in the right way. And that's anything from devices to homework discipline to, shifting up and out to transitioning to adulthood and expectations around that.
Yeah. Okay, there's such an interesting thing that just happened as you were talking, or that was running through my head, because it strikes me that there's this almost weird duality where, on the one hand, they really want and need that structure. And so when they come into your sessions, they're they're like, I'm up for whatever you have
Yeah.
planned,
Yeah.
which is great. On the flip side of that, what the question that was sort of running through my mind is, do we have kids that haven't been taught some critical skills or haven't been given space to learn some critical skills like exploring their own needs and wants, creativity, sort of self-determination, that then leaves them in a session with you going, I don't know, you tell me, right? There's an interesting dichotomy there that is both a need for structure, but also it's almost like some of them need to be pushed into not structure. Is that making any sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, and maybe to contextualize my practice a little bit more, I can talk about some of the theory behind it because it might help color things in a little bit. But it is true because obviously on one hand, they want this like expression and freedom and they want to be able to have this opportunity to kind of like, I always say like paint their own canvas, right? But at the same time, they need these like these boundaries and these things in place. So typically the work that I do is based on this evidence-based methodology called life crafting that came out of the University of Rotterdam from Dr. Michaela Skippers and Nicholas Siegler. And effectively, and anyone could use it. Like I always say, it's probably really good at retirement age as well, because it's thinking about like your life at that juncture. And a lot of it's tied to purpose. But so there's 4 core components of it that I run through. So one's thinking around like discovering values and passions. Secondly is thinking about envisaging like an ideal future life. Thirdly is goal setting. And then fourthly, in the final session of the program that I run is that it's a public commitment to goal. So mom, dad, guardian, whoever the right person is kind of jumps into the last call and we do a share back, right? So the first 2 steps in particular are really around that like creative self-expression, right? And I have guided exercises because if you ask a kiddo, what are your values, right? They have
Yeah.
like, kindness, maybe they'll say,
To
or
be clear, you can ask an adult that question, and it's a really hard question for them to answer too.
exactly. Yeah. Someone actually asked me the other week and I was like, whoa, they put you on your toes. It's pretty funny. So this comes up through stories. So we'll go through guided exercises of like, tell me about a time you had an awesome accomplishment, or like, tell me when you've overcome a challenge. And I've got some like different career tools that I do to help them think about, you know, obviously some kids are going to fall into like, the STEM side of things. Some are going to be more creative, all of things of that nature. So I guess that's how like that duality kind of gets brought together, I would say, in my practice. But I think from a broader and like a non-practice standpoint of just teens, like they want both, right? And I think that's where they've got the boundary, they're going to push against it. They want the freedom to spend all their time on YouTube or gaming or, social media talking to friends and doing those things that we might have just done in a very different way in our adolescence. But then they also want that structure and they want to expect dinner at a certain time and they need to know that they have a bedtime and they have to get up, that they do look to adults for those things.
Yeah.
Does that help
Yeah.
kind of weave it
Yeah,
together?
no, it does. And I think, I mean, I love the way that you use that, structure. I have a similar but different structure that I use in my coaching, where long-term vision planning is a really critical piece of it, and it is a space for both structure and creativity. But I'm also like, I'm finding myself, and you and I talked a little bit before we hit record today, that there are some skills out there that kids need
Yeah.
to function well in the world. And they're not the type of skills that are prioritized in a traditional structured learning environment, right? Like in your average, US public school, and I can only speak to the US for this,
Yeah.
but in your average sort of public school, it tends to be very structured, and it tends to value academic learning, rote memorization, right? Can you solve this problem, right, in the way that I taught you to solve this problem? There's a lot of other things kids need in order to actually be successful. Can you talk about that a little bit, both what those are and then how you help highlight those or bring those to the forefront in the coaching work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when we just look at it from like the education standpoint, the way I tend to think about it is like academics is just one piece of the puzzle. And for many students, like it is definitely important. It leads to pathways to future education, future learning, but it's only one part of it. So even if that aspect's done really well, there are other elements. So just recently, the World Economic Forum released like a jobs of the future report for 2025. And interestingly, they surveyed like over 1,000 employers, right? And they asked them about like, what are some of the core skills that are important? This is in today, right? And so maybe it's going to shift in 5-10 years, but it even just struck me really. So for instance, like the first one's analytical thinking. I think that predominantly school does that. And we talked about, the math and English examples earlier. So that's maybe more of that academic side, but some of the other like top 10 skills. So one was like resilience, flexibility, adaptability. Another one's like empathy and active listening. Another one's like leadership and kind of social influence, creative thinking, and then like empathy and active listening was another one. So those are about 5 of the 10, right? Well, of course they are in a typical school environment cultivated in some degree, but I think that they're not talked about and labeled of like, hey, we need to cultivate a skill of empathy and active listening, or we need to cultivate a skill of social influence, or, lifelong learning was another one, right? So in my practice with teens and young adults, I'll help them discover that spike, right? So it's helping them think about that skill, that strength, that interest. And I think just to call out for parents, like these are things that you can absolutely do yourselves as well, because obviously not everyone has like parents can absolutely do these things in their own ways. And I think that might be having, guided discussions, really like double clicking when your daughter or your son shows an interest in a certain area and really focusing and following on with that. But like from this standpoint, it's like, how can you cultivate a skill if you haven't heard of it or you don't know what it is, and then you don't know how to build a pathway of it? So we'll just say like, what does creative thinking actually mean to you? And a lot of the times, we all have creativity in us. And obviously there's this, you have to be like an artist or a musician. There's like the typical thing to be creative. But I always talk to a lot of kids that they might be like a really creative problem solver. And it's like, well, how do you develop those skills? I was just on a call yesterday, actually, and a kid was telling me, he's like, we get way too much homework. He's in 9th grade. And he said, like, we get like 2 hours per subject per night. Like if I was to do all the homework, I wouldn't sleep and I'd go to school the next day without any sleep. But he's like, I found a way to do these graphs, I think for math. And then if I like just tweaked a little thing here, I could take a quick screenshot and I can do, instead of an hour and a half, I can do it in 10 minutes. And I'm like, that is fantastic. If you're 25 and your boss puts something on your desk that's going to take a week and a half and you're able to do it in a day, that is going to help you into the future. And obviously for this example, it's making sure the quality is still there and everything of that nature. So it's how do we have, like, that's an example of like cultivating creative thinking, right? And so kids are starting to think in these fun ways. And I think just finally, like I can talk about this because I'm quite passionate about it, as you know, but the empathy and the active listening, I just think is huge. And it's just not labeled. And if we look at things like theory of mind, obviously it develops from, a few months old when a little baby's looking up at, caregiver and they're smiling and they're laughing and they're starting to understand. But actually learning to navigate those insights from theory of mind and perspective take and think, okay, that person said something in that way because they're hoping to get that outcome. And we still need to do this as adults. And you'll see people obviously very successful have really strong theory of mind. So developing that empathy, developing those active listening skills to be able to use those insights and navigate them for your own benefit and the benefit of the cohort that you're in at that point in time is really valuable. And then we might end up working, just to round that out a little bit, on like, what are creative projects, or, what are tasks like? So, another example, just quickly, one of the kids I'm working with, they're very quite academic. And so they sometimes can feel that, and this is the word that they use, people are quote unquote stupid because, in compared to them. And we actually set like what a focus area, and one of their goals is, instead of using, this is like 2 weeks ago, they said, like, instead of using, the word stupid, try and use more analytical language themselves. And we're getting ready for like the parent shareback presentation. I just had the most heartwarming moment yesterday, Christy. We were talking about it. I was like, how are you going to tell your parents about this? And they go, I'm going to say that not everyone has the same thought processes that I do. And I was just like, oh my gosh, yes. So that's maybe an example of like that leadership, that social influence when they're and like combined probably with that empathy and like perspective taking point. So yeah, there's a lot there, but that's.
Well, I have to say, it is really refreshing to hear, I mean, to hear you talk about it, but also that this was called out in, by the World Economic Forum as a critical task, this empathy and active listening piece,
Yeah.
because I feel like, at least here in the US, we are in a space where there's not a lot of empathy and there's not a lot of active listening happening between people. And I think that's worldwide as well, but it certainly feels very prominent in the US. And in fact, there's an entire movement. I don't know. I call it a movement. I don't know how big it is, but of people who are arguing that empathy is actually the exact opposite of what we all need, which is so distressing to me, given what I know of the science and just what
Yeah.
relationship, how you build healthy relationships, right? So it's really refreshing to hear you prioritizing that and to hear the World Economic Forum saying, no, this still matters.
Yeah. I think there's 2 points there. One's a little bit of a left turn. So before I get to the left turn, and I think like for those we're recording in April 2025, so like the tariffs have been a big thing. And I actually been asking a lot of the kiddos I'm working with, like, what do they think about it? And it's just been really interesting for them to get their different perspectives from like an economic standpoint and understanding like these global like political tensions and like the implications and having, like most people might want to have like a cup of coffee and like how's that going to change if like the coffee they want coming from a different region of the world, and how does that influence like producers in different places. So I think that's been an interesting vehicle just to understand it, and without getting into economic philosophy and implications and
Yeah.
things like that, just interesting to see what and hear some of those things. And like I think it's a great conversation to have. Secondly, and I think when I think about empathy, it's like quite closely tied to compassion, but I guess the difference, like the way, and probably from a definition standpoint, is like empathy is like, placing yourself maybe in someone's shoes and like feeling and understanding and the experiences they're having. Whereas compassion almost extends to like wanting to help and make a difference, right? And there's this really cool study that I've been quite interested in lately. So out of the University of North Carolina and the University of Texas, a few researchers did a study, about 1,000 students. It's pretty decent size, average age of about 15 and a half. I think the researchers are Karen Bluth, Michael Malarkey, and Christine Lathran. So, and what they sought to explore was self-compassion. And obviously, like the teenage years is like a really cool window where all the neural development's going on. It's an opportunity for growth. And they had this thesis that self-compassion on the one hand would be associated with curiosity. And secondly, self-compassion would also be associated with resilience. And so in this study, and it was a correlative study, it's not causal necessarily. So, but what they found is that high levels of self-compassion are actually associated with high levels of resilience. And secondly, high levels of self-compassion are also associated with high levels of curiosity. So it almost like going back to the start of our conversation, when you think about what teens are going through, like you could understand it's probably pretty challenging to be like curious about your future or like resilient in the face of adversity with all of these different factors going on, those four that I talked about at the start. But I just thought it was such a neat thing because self-compassion is like actually demonstrated to be a modifiable trait through things like mindfulness, and there are other techniques and I can maybe touch on them. But by, encouraging teens to be compassionate and think about themselves in that way, like that's going to be associated with increases, like it doesn't lead to, but there's associations with the greater resilience and greater curiosity. So I just think that's really neat. So like, and I'll like maybe like another example is I jumped on a call once. It was like a Sunday night and the kid was just like, I just had a bad day. And they played golf or something and they didn't swing the ball well and they had another sport. And they took me through this like 12-hour day. And I was like, totally appreciate, like you're tired, you're flat out, you're doing all of these different things. It's challenging, but like, do you think you're going to remember this in like a week or a month or a year's time? And like just helping them contextualize this in their whole journey. And I might even have discussions of like, hey, why don't you like think about what you were like a year ago or 5 years ago or as a child? And, at one point, like 1+3 was like difficult for you, right? Or learning the alphabet. So we're all going through these developmental journeys and helping them understand that they can be like kind and compassionate to themselves and realize that in this space. And then that opens them up, hopefully, to having greater levels of like resilience and curiosity.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I mean, I think self-compassion is something lacking for many of us. We weren't taught it as teenagers, right? I know a lot of the parents that I work with, in fact, had a conversation just today, had a call for my membership group, and one of the parents on the call was saying, I feel like a failure, right? And we talked through that a little bit. This parent is anything but a failure as a parent, but there was certainly a lacking of self-compassion and failing to recognize their own amazingness. And if we can't give it to ourselves, it's really hard to teach our teens, right? So I'm curious, and maybe this is a good note, to wrap our conversation up on today, is if self-compassion is at least correlated with resilience and, at least correlated with curiosity, both of which are skills that the World Economic Forum has called out as critical in for jobs in this day and age.
Yeah.
How do we as parents help build that or teach that to our kids?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And the first thing that comes to mind is vulnerability without actually having thought about it, but like in leading into this. But I think that having those conversations about setbacks, challenges, frustrations, annoyances, and maybe like how that's made us feel as adults in this situation, and then how we've dealt and how we've coped with it, I think can probably be really powerful because, on the shell, like the teens are like kiddos looking up to us, but like no one's perfect. And I think it's actually more about normalizing that and whether it's mum coming home from work and saying like, I've had a really stressful day, someone on my team resigned, I've got to take on all this work, like this has made me feel these certain ways, and actually starting to talk about feelings and experiences and emotions in a way that's tending to the emotionality of them, but also touching on like the rationality of how to actually deal with them and mobilize those problems. And then also recognizing, hey, this is impermanent. This situation's not going to last forever. We all go through these different challenges. And that probably helps teens a lot with whether they're going through challenging social things or dynamics at school, whether they're just going through like, the brain development and emotionally, like sometimes it's heightened because you'll see from month to month or week to week or maybe even hour to hour different changes. You can obviously observe that, but helping them understand that these states of mind are like impermanent. How do we have this balance across time and space? I think that's a way parents can probably lead, by some vulnerability and talking to personal experiences, and then maybe talking to their kids and ask them for those examples and then bringing those to life.
I love that. Well, and that also serves to create connection and relationship, which is so critical with our teens, right? I also think this is something that we did at the end of our call today, with the parents who were there and all of whom, had some struggle to kind of, and I didn't think about it in these terms, but we ended the call with everyone sort of committing to doing something kind for themselves,
Nice.
right? Which I don't know that we teach our teens. We're not good at doing that ourselves. And again, if we can't do it for ourselves, it's really hard to teach.
Yeah.
But it strikes me that we could all use a little more self-compassion and compassion for others, right? That empathy and active listening piece, those all go kind of hand in hand together.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I just think it's, very key. So it's a really good point.
Well, there's so much more that we could dive into here, but in the interest of time, I'd like to just sort of wrap up by, saying like, what if parents are thinking, wow, it'd be really helpful for my kid to get some support. It's not therapeutic support, it's like life support, future support. What is the best place for parents to find you?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd welcome any parents getting in touch. So manyroads.co is the website, and my email is probably just the easiest way. So will@manyroads.co. So you guys can get in touch with me there. Yeah. And just to all the parents like listening and educators and everyone, like, you guys are doing such an amazing job and having such a profound and powerful influence as well on your kiddos' lives or those that you're impacting. So just thanks for everything you do. As I said at the start, it's just such a pleasure to see so much dedication and commitment, and it's gives me a lot of faith and optimism for the future.
Yeah, love it. We will make sure that your email address and your website and all of that is in the show notes for for those parents who are walking around doing the laundry, driving, right now, wherever you are, they'll be in the show notes so you can track those down and track Will down. And I so appreciate you ending on the note that parents are doing a good job, because so many feel like they're screwing it up, especially with teenagers. It's really challenging, right? Can be really challenging. So Will, thank you for the work that you're doing, the support that you are providing to teens out in the world. As you said, they're navigating some really challenging things that are different than what we all navigated. So I just think this type of work can be so, so valuable. So thank you. And thank you for sharing everything here on the podcast.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a delight.
I hope you enjoyed that interview. I just think Will is a treat to speak with. He's, just genuine and warm and really clearly cares about the work that he does with teens. And, let's be honest, working with teens is not something that everyone is cut out for. But, Will's work serves families by serving teens. And so if you are parenting a teen or a young adult or someone who is in struggle in that, tween, teen, early 20s age range that could use Will's support, please, please, please reach out to him. Let him know that I sent you, and you can find his contact information in the show notes. In the meantime, I'm also a believer that parents need support, and I support parents of teens, tweens, and young adults, both through my one-on-one coaching for parents and through the Heartful Parent Academy. I hope you will check out those resources and consider joining us in the Academy or reaching out for some one-on-one support, or perhaps a combination of both. Thanks for joining us for today's episode. Reach out to Will, reach out to me, and please, please, please don't forget to drop that 5-star review for the podcast wherever it is you listen, whether it's YouTube, iTunes, or Apple Podcasts. Wherever you find your podcast, those 5-star reviews help more people find the podcast and benefit from all the awesome stuff that we share on here. All right, that's all I've got for you today. I'll see you next time. Cheers.